Chapter 2, 3 and an Extra, from Plain Tales from the Hills. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. Plain Tales from the Hills by Rudyard Kipling. Chapter 2, 3 and an Extra. When halter and heel ropes are slipped, do not give chase with sticks, but with grain. A Punjabi proverb. After marriage arrives a reaction, sometimes a big, sometimes a little one, but it does come sooner or later, and must be tided over by both parties if they desire the rest of their lives to go with the current. In the case of the Cusack Bremmels, this reaction did not set in till the 3rd year after the wedding. Bremmel was hard to hold at the best of times, but he was a beautiful husband until the baby died, and Mrs. Bremmel wore black and grew thin and mourned as if the bottom of the universe had fallen out. Perhaps Bremmel ought to have comforted her. He tried to do so, I think, but the more he comforted, the more Mrs. Bremmel grieved, and consequently the more uncomfortable Bremmel grew. The fact was that they both needed a tonic, and they got it. Mrs. Bremmel can afford to laugh now, but it was no laughing matter to her at the time. You see, Mrs. Hawksby appeared on the horizon, and where she existed was fair chance of trouble. At Simla her by-name was the Stormy Petrel. She had won that title 5 times to my own certain knowledge. She was a little, brown, thin, almost skinny woman with big, rolling, violet-blue eyes, and the sweetest manners in the world. You had only to mention her name at afternoon teas for every woman in the room to rise up and call her, well, not blessed. She was clever, witty, brilliant, and sparkling beyond most of her kind, but possessed of many devils of malice and mischievousness. She could be nice, though, even to her own sex. Oh, but that's another story. Bremmel went off at score after the baby's death, and the general discomfort that followed, and Mrs. Hawksby annexed him. She took no pleasure in hiding her captives. She annexed him publicly, and saw that the public saw it. He rode with her, and walked with her, and talked with her, and picnicked with her, and tiffined at Pelletti's with her, till people put up their eyebrows and said, "Shocking!" Mrs. Bremmel stayed at home, turning over the dead baby's frocks and crying into the empty cradle. She did not care to do anything else. But some 8 dear, affectionate lady friends explained the situation at length to her, in case she should miss the cream of it. Mrs. Bremmel listened quietly and thanked them for their good offices. She was not as clever as Mrs. Hawksby, but she was no fool. She kept her own counsel and did not speak to Bremmel of what she had heard. This is worth remembering. Speaking to or crying over a husband never did any good yet. When Bremmel was at home, which was not often, he was more affectionate than usual, and that showed his hand. The affection was forced partly to soothe his own conscience and partly to soothe Mrs. Bremmel. It failed in both regards. Then the A.D.C. in waiting was commanded by their Excellencies Lord and Lady Lytton to invite Mr. and Mrs. Cusack Bremmel to Peterhof on July 26th at 9:30 p.m. Dancing in the bottom left-hand corner. "I can't go," said Mrs. Bremmel. "It's too soon after poor little Flora, but it need not stop you, Tom." She meant what she said then, and Bremmel said that he would go just to put in an appearance. Here he spoke the thing which was not, and Mrs. Bremmel knew it. She guessed, a woman's guess is much more accurate than a man's certainty, that he had meant to go from the first, and with Mrs. Hawksby. She sat down to think, and the outcome of her thoughts was that the memory of a dead child was worth considerably less than the affections of a living husband. She made her plan and staked her all upon it. In that hour she discovered that she knew Tom Bremmel thoroughly, and this knowledge she acted on. "Tom," said she, "I shall be dining out at the Longmores on the evening of the 26th. You had better dine at the club." This saved Bremmel from making an excuse to get away and dine with Mrs. Hawksby, so he was grateful and felt small and mean at the same time, which was wholesome. Bremmel left the house at 5 for a ride. About 5:30 in the evening, a large leather-covered basket came in from Phelps for Mrs. Bremmel. She was a woman who knew how to dress, and she had not spent a week on designing that dress and having it gored and hemmed and herring-boned and tucked and rucked, or whatever the terms are, for nothing. It was a gorgeous dress, slight mourning, I can't describe it, but it was what the Queen calls a creation. a thing that hit you straight between the eyes and made you gasp. She had not much heart for what she was going to do, but as she glanced at the long mirror she had the satisfaction of knowing that she had never looked so well in her life. She was a large blonde, and when she chose carried herself superbly. After the dinner at the Longmores she went on to the dance, a little late, and encountered Bremmel with Mrs. Hawksby on his arm. That made her flush, and as the men crowded round her for dances she looked magnificent. She filled up all her dances except 3, and those she left blank. Mrs. Hawksby caught her eye once, and she knew it was war, real war, between them. She started handicapped in the struggle, for she had ordered Bremmel about just the least little bit in the world too much, and he was beginning to resent it. Moreover, he had never seen his wife look so lovely. He stared at her from doorways and glared at her from passages as she went about with her partners, and the more he stared the more taken was he. He could scarcely believe that this was the woman with the red eyes and the black stuff gown who used to weep over the eggs at breakfast. Mrs. Hawksby did her best to hold him in play, but after 2 dances he crossed over to his wife and asked for a dance. "I'm afraid you've come too late, Mr. Bremmel," she said, with her eyes twinkling. Then he begged her to give him a dance, and as a great favour she allowed him the 5th waltz. Luckily 5 stood vacant on his programme. They danced it together, and there was a little flutter round the room. Bremmel had a sort of notion that his wife could dance, but he never knew she danced so divinely. At the end of that waltz he asked for another, as a favour, not as a right, and Mrs. Bremmel said, "Show me your programme, dear." He showed it as a naughty little schoolboy hands up contraband sweets to a master. There was a fair sprinkling of H on it, besides H at supper. Mrs. Bremmel said nothing, but she smiled contemptuously, ran her pencil through 7 and 9, 2 H's, and returned to the card with her own name written above, a pet name that only she and her husband used. Then she shook her finger at him and said, laughing, "Oh, you silly, silly boy." Mrs. Hawksby heard that, and she owned as much, felt that she had had the worst of it. Bremmel accepted 7 and 9 gratefully. They danced 7 and sat out 9 in one of the little tents. What Bremmel said and what Mrs. Bremmel said is no concern of anyone's. When the band struck up the Roast Beef of England, the 2 went out into the veranda, and Bremmel began looking for his wife's dandy, which was before rickshaw days. While she went into the cloakroom, Mrs. Hawksby came up and said, "You take me in to supper, I think, Mr. Bremmel." Bremmel turned red and looked foolish. I'm going home with my wife, Mrs. Hawksby. I think there's been a little mistake." Being a man, he spoke as though Mrs. Hawksby were entirely responsible. Mrs. Bremmel came out of the cloakroom in a swansdown cloak with a white cloud round her head. She looked radiant, and she had a right to. The couple went off in the darkness together, Bremmel riding very close to the dandy. Then says Mrs. Hawksby to me, she looked a trifle faded and jaded in the lamplight, "Take my word for it, the silliest woman can manage a clever man, but it needs a very clever woman to manage a fool." Then we went in to supper. End of 3 and an Extra, Chapter 2. Recording by Mike Harris.